So, we just saw Hume, who's Philo in this, argue that he doesn't mind that the design argument has the structure of what logicians call an argument from analogy, where you say A is like B in a certain respects, therefore A must be like B in a further respect, and there's your conclusion. Right. You know, so we say, well, the eye is like the watch in some respects, you know, and having parts that integrally work together to enable it to fulfill a function. So, wait a second, the watch needed a designer, it didn't just get there, so mustn't the eye need a designer, or the ear, you know, things in nature. And so there's the further respect, that's your conclusion of the analogy, saying, well, you know, if these are, if something like the watch and things in nature like eyes and ears are alike in some respects, shouldn't they be alike in the respect of needing a designer? But of course, who would the designer of the eye or the ear be but God? And so you get the design argument as an argument for God's existence. But Hume, in the person of Philo, says, my problem is not that this is an argument from analogy, but he thinks it's a bad argument from analogy. And I'll let you think about that, you know. But what he's saying is, you can have good and bad arguments from analogy when you're doing what we call comparing apples with apples, comparing things that are very much alike. Then you've got a good argument from analogy if you're reasoning from one case to the other and they're very similar. But he says the more we depart from the similarity of the cases, the worse becomes our analogy. And so he says it would be very strong to conclude the circulation of blood from one human being to another, because you're really comparing apples with apples there. Not as strong, but still a good argument to look at circulation of blood in an animal like the frog and say, but yeah, it does the same in humans. But Hume says arguments from analogy can lead us astray if we're comparing very two different things. And so he says, if we try to look at similarities in the tubules that carry sap in trees or in the stalks of plants, and say, well, sap is similar to blood in an animal because it has to go through little tubules, Hume says we're way off in terms of comparing like with like. And he says we can be led to a wrong conclusion, like that sap in vegetables circulates in the same way that blood does in the bodies of animals. And it does not. I mean, it goes up. It's going to go up pretty soon. It comes up from the roots in the spring, and, you know, we get nourishment for the leaves to grow, but then it goes back into the roots in the fall. So he says an argument from analogy, if we're not comparing like cases, number one, it's not a very strong argument. It doesn't give you a good reason to buy the conclusion on the basis of similarity, but it also may lead you totally astray. And of course, you know, you got to read between the lines here, right? Hume doesn't think that, you know, that God was around as creator, and so he's going to try to convince us that the argument from analogy, the design argument, would lead us astray into thinking that we needed God around as creator. That's where Hume's going. Hume's a skeptical philosopher. We're going to look a little bit more at Hume and the empiricists later on. So then Hume says if we're talking about very unlike things, then we can be led astray by arguments from analogy. If we're comparing apples and apples, I said I live in the house my parents moved into in 1955. I inherited it. It's an old house in Hamden. The records go back to 1900. Neither myself nor my parents was around in 1900, and yet I don't have any problem concluding that somebody built that house, that it didn't just get there on Hickory Avenue, but somebody designed and built it, right? Because every other house I've seen has needed a designer and builder, So why not my house? So houses we've observed in the past have had builders, so this one must have had a builder. In other words, you can go by analogy. But Hume says, well, it's a case of the universe like the case of a house, where, something like a house or a watch is planned and manufactured all at one time or built all at one time. But the universe, he says, could be different. So the presumption of a similar cause is only a guess or a conjecture, So he says that if we're comparing the building of something like a house or a watch to the universe as a whole, to say, well, the watch needed a designer, so the universe needed a designer, he says we're not comparing like with like. But, Hume never really addresses a point that's made later about things like the eyes and ears. It seems to me if we're comparing the watch with something like an eye or an ear, then we are comparing more similar things. But of course, if you talk about, he says order, arrangement, adjustment to final causes, that's Aristotelian language. A final cause for Aristotle is the purpose for which a thing is made. After Newton, we don't have final causes in nature. And after Darwin, that's one of the things that was brought out in the video I showed last time. So without observations, the above could be caused by something internal to matter itself. And Paley doesn't like this suggestion of Hume's that there might be some principle in matter, but that leads to order. But basically, he says the elements may fall into some exquisite arrangement by some unknown internal cause. Anybody know what, and this is even before my time, but I had something, I had this chemistry book when I went through my chemistry phase in late elementary school years, that a friend of mine called the Book of Forbidden Chemistry, because I showed it to him, and he taught chemistry at a junior college, community college, out right next to the University of Virginia. And he said, boy, they'd never get away with publishing some of the things that are in that nowadays. But anyway, does anybody know what rock candy used to be? It's not something that they would push. Mrs. Obama would not want to push it as something on your school lunch menu. Basically, rock candy was pure sugar. If you heat up sugar, like just take white sugar, put water on the stove, heat it up, dissolve the sugar, and then you put a string into the water and you let it cool, what happens is crystals form on the sugar. They look something like quartz crystals, but they're sugar crystals. So there are principles in nature that cause these crystals to form. And I think this is the kind of thing that Hume's thinking about. Well, there might be principles. In other words, the crystals look so perfect that you might think, well, they're the product of design. Now, of course, the traditional Judeo-Christian position is, well, so what? If there is a principle in nature that causes sugar crystals to form or quartz crystals to form in the ground or something else, God is the author of the laws of nature along with the rest of the world. So it doesn't get you away from design saying there's a principle in nature that leads to order. But Hume's point here is if we can explain something by a strictly physical principle as the cause of that order, then we don't necessarily have to bring in God as the cause of that order. And this is where Hume is going. And this is basically Darwin's point. I say on the bottom of this note the similarity to Darwinism. That basically, how do we get the eye? Well, Paley says it must have been designed, Well, if you believe that humans were like zapped on the earth, immediately, which is kind of what Genesis seems to say, then the case of the eye would be like the case of the watch or of a house where God would think of us, design us, and zap the eye in to existence full blown. But of course, the story that Darwin tells us is, well, over millions of years, the animals with advantageous variations win out in the struggle for existence, and so the animals over time with better eyes had an evolutionary advantage, and so over millions of years you get more and more complex eyes, not as the result of an immediate process like making a watch or building a house, but you get it strictly by chance and the forces of nature coming to play, and natural selection coming into play, favoring for survival, for evolutionary survival, the fittest animals, which in many cases would be the animals that develop better eyes. So, in other words, this was Darwin's original story. Now, as I say, there's a way of reconciling evolution and looking at evolution as a God-directed process, as the means by which God affected creation. But then you have to kind of take with a grain of salt passages in Genesis that seem to indicate that human beings were zapped on the scene, in the garden immediately, like a watch or a house, designed by God and essentially not built, but brought into existence. So So Hume is writing about 50 years before Darwin, 50 or 60 years. And Hume's no scientist, he's a philosopher. But then people knew what was going on in the sciences. And so he speculates. He doesn't know what causes might lead to order. But Hume, as kind of an everyday educated man in the late 1700s, knows that there are principles in nature like magnetism and heat and cold, attraction and repulsion. He says so some of these might lead to order. He says design is only one of the factors. So some things in nature affect others by design, but he says it's illegitimate to reason that all do. Long he goes from the part to the whole, basically saying some things can be the product of design, so why not everything we see? And so he says it's like drawing conclusions about the generation of a human being from a single hair. It's interesting with cloning now that might be possible. Now, Cleanthes, and Hume doesn't do a good job, I don't think, of responding to this, but Cleanthes brings up the same thing that Paley brings up. Remember, Cleanthes is the character in the dialogue who's very intellectual about his faith. And rather than have his faith depend on miracles or, divine initiated miracles, he places a lot of stock in these rational arguments. So the eye has a structure that implies a contriver means a designer, just another word for that. That it is the product of design is the most obvious conclusion. Now again, a naturalist is going to hit this. Theists today, people defending the design argument, basically say that, well, the assumption that God designed the universe is the most reasonable and obvious conclusion. Whereas somebody who believes that the material world is all that exists, and there's no such thing as a spirit in us, or God, if God's a spirit, as the Bible says, there must not be a God around, they would not buy the claim that creation by God is the most obvious conclusion to something like, how did the eye get here? And we just said, I mean, Darwin would tell us a story of better eyes, more complex eyes, developing over millions of years by adaptation and natural selection. And natural selection, or the survival of the fittest, favors those life forms with the best adaptations. And so you get better and better, more and more adapted eyes. At least this is Darwin's story. Well, another example they use is human sexuality. But, you could bring in a number of things here. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but another point, and I think your book focuses on this, is one of the things the design argument wants us to do is, from a very imperfect world with a lot of flaws, it wants us to conclude that the maker of this very flawed and imperfect world was nonetheless all-powerful and perfect and all-knowing. And Hume thinks that logically we can't go that far. But now here Hume says, even, and so from an imperfect world, the design argument, he says, is not on very good ground logically when it says, well, okay, this is a very imperfect world, the designer of the world must be perfect. But also, he says, suppose the world were perfect, you couldn't conclude that the designer and maker of the world is perfect even from that. What he's saying is, well, now this is not a very good point by Hume, but he says maybe the designer, a carpenter who makes a ship didn't necessarily design it, was not necessarily brilliant. From the complexity and beauty of a ship, we may form an exalted idea of the ingenuity of the carpenter who made it. And my dad was a carpenter who at times worked at Maryland Dry Dock building ships. But that doesn't mean that he was capable of designing a ship from scratch himself, right? He worked for plans. And he says, well, a carpenter could be a stupid mechanic who merely imitated others and copied an art. Or, we shouldn't look at, say, a graphic like this and say, well, that's a really nice graphic. The designer and builder of this PowerPoint must have been a really good, ingenious, and creative artist to put a graphic like that there. But the designer and builder of this PowerPoint might be somebody who's artistically very challenged, who has a hard time drawing stick figures. I'm talking about moi here, right? The only way I got through art in 5th grade was if you at least looked like you were trying. The art teacher would give you a good grade, and I was able to at least give the illusion that I was trying. But the point is, what is this graphic? It's a cut and paste, piece of clip art, right? I can't draw a ship that looks like that. But being a stupid mechanic who who just imitated others and copied an art, I can copy a piece of clip art and put it in there, but it would be wrong to conclude that a person, and I did make up the PowerPoint, that the person who designed the PowerPoint is this great artist, So Hume's trying to say that even if the world were better than it is, we wouldn't necessarily be able to conclude the maker was perfect. Now, here's the thing. When Hume gives us other possibilities that the maker of the world might be like a stupid carpenter who merely copied an art, or he says the world could be the latest attempt in a string of botched and bungled worlds by some less than perfect, inept God. In other words, it's like taking a pottery class, right? Somebody's taking a pottery class and they're trying to learn how to make, a piece of pottery on the wheel, and they come out with something that's really misshapen, and they say, oh man, I didn't do that very well. Let me just, throw this away and start again from scratch because I'm still learning how to work with clay on the wheel. Well, Hume says, couldn't that be the same? In other words, couldn't we, from the imperfect nature of the world, conclude that its maker was somebody, some lesser deity, who was trying to learn how to make a world, and he made this world, and it's like a bad pot from somebody who's learning to do pottery. He said, oh man, I really messed up that world. Well, leave that alone. Let's move on to the next, you know. Now, again, when Hume throws out these possibilities, you got to understand what he's doing. It isn't that Hume thinks that there really was some lesser God who created the world as a rough first attempt and then left it. But he's making a logical point. He's saying from the observations of the world, of this imperfect world, that are the basis of the design argument, there would be as much reason logically to conclude that about the designer of the world, you know, that it's some lesser deity who botched the job, as it would to conclude that the designer of the world is the perfect God of theism, who has all the attributes we saw in the ontological argument. And Philo, which is Hume, also says, well, why should we necessarily assume that the conclusion of the design argument always has to be that there's only one creator and designer? Now, of course, for somebody like Aquinas, you know, these lesser gods don't exist. The Greek gods aren't around. The gods of Mesopotamia and Egypt, you know, the ones with a woman's body and a crocodile head and all, they're not around either. You know, there's only one God for Aquinas, the God of theism. But Hume says if we merely went from observations about the world and tried to say, well, what can we get out of them logically? He says, well, if we think about things like houses and ships, they're built by many individuals, designers and carpenters cooperating to build a house or a ship. So he says, why couldn't you conclude then that the world was designed and built by a committee of lesser gods? Now, again, it's not that Hume is trying to convince us that this is the way the world actually was made, but he's trying to say, if we're trying to make the design argument do all the work by itself, we have as much justification logically for the conclusion that the world was designed by a committee of multiple gods than we would for the conclusion that Aquinas wants to get out of it, that it was, and that Paley wants to get out of it, that it was designed by the God of monotheism, the God of the Bible and church tradition. So that's where Hume is trying to go with this logically. He's trying to say, well, look, you can't absolutely conclude what Aquinas and later Paley wants to conclude, that there's only one designer, and that designer is the perfect God of the Bible. And he says, well, if you're going to give, human-like attributes, then why not assume that we've also got a genealogy of these gods? He says, why not argue with the pre-Socratic philosopher Epicurus that reason must have human form since no one is seen otherwise? So if the gods exist, they must exist in human form. And he says, the design hypothesis allows us to conclude maybe that the universe arose from something like design, but he says everything else, just from the argument itself, is wide open to fantasy, you know. And he gives several other options. And again, it's not that Hume is trying to convince us that any of these, you know, that it was built by an infant deity or a senile old man deity, but he's trying to say that there's as much justification for these other conclusions given the premises of the design argument as there is for the conclusion that the designer of the world is the God of the Bible. And he says if we're making the gods in our own image, then, you know, he says one creation myth that the Brahmins use is that the world was spun by a big spider. You know, now this is not, obviously Hume is not going to try to convince us that that really is how the world got here. But he's saying if we lived in a planet of spiders that, you know, wanted to build the gods in their own image, well, this would seem a very likely conclusion from their perspective. So anyway, that's Hume. We're not going to do anything on evil. But that's basically what Hume was saying. And you know what? I mean, there's no sense in showing 9 minutes of a video on Descartes. We'll save that for after the break. But anyway, you know, so this is what Hume is trying to say, that that the design argument doesn't give us by itself, you know, real good reason for the conclusion that people like Paley and Aquinas want to draw from it, that there are just as likely other logical possibilities. But again, for monotheists like Paley or Aquinas, these other gods aren't very plausible possibilities. Yes, conceptually, we say, well, okay, conceptually the world could have gotten here by being spun by a big spider or by some, you know, bot, you know, infant deity who's learning to make a world, or by some committee. But they would say, you know what, Hume, you're wrong on this point. Those other options, while they're there logically, they're not nearly as plausible as the option that the God of monotheism, the God of the Bible and church tradition, made the world. Yes, Hume, they're there as logical possibilities, but no one should put a lot of stock in you know, your claim that they're just as possible as the conclusion that the God of monotheism made. You know, I think that's basically what you know, people like Aquinas and Paley how they would respond to Hume. You know, and of course we already said Paley says, I don't even know what you mean by an internal principle of matter that leads to order rather than design. Now, as I said, Darwin maybe fleshed that out much better by giving us a story of how an internal principle like natural selection can lead over time to more order, you know. So he's, but still, my problem with the theist about evolution is comes from a book that I read when I was in high school called Human Destiny wasn't even written by an evangelical believer, but by scientists. And, you know, once you get replication going, you can have this whole story that Darwin tells us about things leading to more and more order. But my problem is, how did we get that first cell? How did we get that first strand of DNA? Because the chances of something with that complexity forming just by mere accident, I mean, the odds are astronomically against that, you know. And it's like somebody like Darwin can tell us a good story if we've already got multi-celled organisms and we've, you know, already got DNA, you know, then he can tell us the story about adaptation and natural selection, you know. But my problem with evolution being an entirely natural process as a theist is, well, how do you get the first strand of DNA? The odds are enormously against it happening by chance, you know. So anyway, but that's just my slant on this. Again, does not matter if you write on this in one, it is one of the options for your term paper. What position you take or whether you agree with me, all that matters is how well did you, you know, formulate and defend whatever position you did take. I mean, from the standpoint of being a teacher, I try to grade papers as like a neutral observer, you know, try to keep my own views out of it, you know, so. Okay, well, look, you all have a great break. If anybody missed a roll, sign it. Thanks for coming out, and look, be safe if you're traveling. You know, take care on the roads. But look, except for some rain, fortunately we're not going to have ice and snow that y'all are going to have to. I can remember going home from Kentucky in April, passing one semi after another in Ohio, run off the road and jackknife because it was snowing so hard as we were coming back on our way to spring break. So, you know, it can happen. We had 2 feet of snow on March 22nd back in the early 90s, blizzard of 93. You know, so it can happen, but the odds against it are pretty long, you know, fortunately. So you all have a good spring break. Take care. Bye-bye. Again, if anybody wants to know over the break what they got, email me, and I'll tell you, you know. Bye-bye.